All right, today while I'm filming the Bill of Rights group skits, you need to fill out your Federalist era guided notes over Washington's presidency. We're going to go through this pretty quickly, but Washington's presidency is going to be known for kind of affecting the way the rest of the presidents following him behave. Um, Washington was the very first president. He was from the state of Virginia, and he's going to be the only president to run without a political party, even though he kind of matches the ideals of those Federalists we were talking about, people who support the Constitution. Um, Washington was inaugurated in New York City. At the time that Washington was president, there wasn't Washington, D.C., where we have the Capitol now. There was no White House. He was inaugurated, which means brought into office, on Wall Street. You know, you've seen Wall Street movies where the stock exchange is. The Federal Building was right across from Wall Street. He's the first president under the new Constitution, and his vice president is John Adams from Massachusetts. A famous picture depicting Washington getting inaugurated on Wall Street. Okay, Washington gets nicknamed the President of Precedents, and precedent was a Bellwork word that we had a few weeks ago. But a precedent is an action that gets treated as an example. And Washington is going to set a lot of precedents for how a president should behave. He enforces the separation of powers and believes in a strong, independent court system. And he really does a good job of limiting government's power. Two things he does that are kind of unique are he makes sure that he uses force to maintain order, something that kind of goes that makes his presidency interesting. One of the first issues that Washington has to deal with is the massive debt that the government has taken on. States are in incredible debt. Remember, before the Constitution, we were 13 independent countries, and each one had to pay for the Revolutionary War on its own. And war, like we've talked about over and over again, is expensive. Each state had to pay back their own debt. So Massachusetts, where it saw a lot of Revolutionary War battles, or New York, or New Jersey, had massive debt. Where states like North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, which didn't see a ton of fighting, really didn't have anywhere near as much debt as those northern states. Alexander Hamilton, a man we've kind of talked about before, was Washington's Secretary of Treasury and a strong Federalist, one of the leading people in favor of the Constitution. And he wanted to create a new plan for the U.S. national government. He wanted to see the national government take over each individual state's debt, make a big national debt instead of each state having its own. Some positives for this is that the national government would show that it could pay for itself. You would have international governments, countries from abroad, being able to buy into this new government. It also forced the states to have an interest in the success of the national government. If their debts are tied to the national government succeeding, they're going to care about the national government succeeding. Some of the negatives, though, southern states didn't spend anywhere near as much as northern states during the war, and they didn't think that having to pay off northern states' debts was fair. So we have a compromise. The Compromise of 1790, pretty big deal. The national government is going to take over all the debt, and this is called assumption, another Bellwork word you had either last week or the week before. And the deal was, if southern states allow for the national government to take over all of the debt, then the new capital of the country would be built somewhere in the south. And it ends up being built between Maryland and Virginia and becomes Washington, D.C. So that's how we get our national capital. Another major issue that Washington had to deal with was a small rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion. The national government is going to need money to pay for the war debt that they had just assumed from all the states. So the way that they decided to do this was to put a tax on the production of whiskey. Now, buying whiskey, there wasn't a tax on that. Selling whiskey, there wasn't a tax on that. There's a tax on making whiskey. If you were a small-time farmer just making ends meet. One of the ways that you would make a little extra money is by making moonshine on your farm. We've all seen that show, Moonshiners, on, I don't know if it's Discovery Channel or History Channel, but that was a very real way for a lot of people to make a little extra cash. Washington himself had a whiskey distillery on his property, and he'd use whiskey production to make a little more money for himself. It was very, very common. It made a lot of people mad. It's going to affect poor farmers more than anybody else, because they're the people who need this little extra money from making whiskey. And these protests turn violent. Those of you who are studying the First Amendment for your Bill of Rights you know that protesting and airing your grievances against the government are completely within your rights, but as soon as those protests become violent, you are not protected by the First Amendment. These big forces of people who are protesting are mostly in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and Washington leads an army into Pennsylvania to intimidate these group of rebels who are trying to come up against the government. This is a big step. It shows that the national government would use force to keep control. They would not let rebellions take place all the time. If you think about it, these Whiskey Rebellion farmers are pretty similar to the Sons of Liberty attacking Boston Harbor during the Boston Tea Party. And Washington's going to show that this government is not going to deal with those little rebellions. Another big issue that Washington had was with Native Americans, who are building alliances with different European countries to try and weaken the United States. And Washington feared that these small Native American attacks backed by the British and the French were going to really weaken the U.S. And he sent one of his top generals into the area to take control, a guy you may know well, Mad Anthony Wayne, who's going to build a fort where the three rivers meet just south of Kendallville in what becomes now the city of Fort Wayne. Mad Anthony, the Fort Wayne Mad Ants, the basketball team in Fort Wayne. Mad Anthony is going to take control of this area, and he's going to have a major victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. American Army defeats a huge group of Native Americans, and it's led by Anthony Wayne. The effects of this is the Treaty of Greenville, and it's important especially for where we live. Native Americans are forced to give up their land in most of Ohio and Indiana and are forced to move west. And this will be a theme that we see repeated over and over again through the rest of our story of American history, is Native Americans continuously being forced farther and farther west. You can see the Battle of Fallen Timbers taking place right outside where today Toledo, Ohio is. It's a good map. Washington also has to deal with foreign problems. The two great powers of Europe, Great Britain and France, have been at war. And they're really pushing the United States to pick a side. Some in America want the U.S. to side with the British, others want to side with the French. And Washington makes a famous precedent in vowing to stay neutral. He doesn't pick a side. He says the country's too young, the country isn't powerful enough, we can't get pulled into these European wars. One of the big issues was this idea of impressment, which is one of our bellwork words this week. Great Britain was capturing American ships that were trading with France. They were stopping America's ability to free trade. One of the big reasons why we fought the American Revolution. American sailors on these ships then would be captured. They'd be forced to serve in the British Navy. So British were capturing Americans, basically holding them prisoner and forcing them to fight. And this was a major source of anger. This is resolved by what gets known as Jay's Treaty, negotiated by John Jay, who's going to travel to Great Britain and ask the British to remove all troops and forts from the American territory and try to help rebuild that relationship between America and Great Britain. Now, this doesn't really deal with that problem of impressment, but it does help to develop a strong tie between America and its former colonial power, Great Britain. One of Washington's most famous precedents is that he didn't seek a third term as president. He was unanimously elected for his first and second terms, but decided that 2 terms was enough, that serving for more than that would be too much. And this was a precedent that was followed for almost 150 years, and then became an amendment to the Constitution. Now presidents can only serve for 2 terms because of this precedent that Washington set. When he was leaving office, he gave a famous farewell speech that we'll dig into tomorrow and Thursday. But in it, he warns about 2 things. One of them we followed for all of about 5 minutes, and one of them lasted for about 150 years. The first was don't create political parties, something we only listened to for 5 minutes. And then the other one was do not make alliances with European countries, something that we listened to up until about the beginning of World War I. So that's Washington's presidency. If you fell behind or you didn't get everything written down that you needed to, feel free to rewind through this and make sure that you get these completed by the end of the period.